Okay, well, for this first lecture in the course, I want to talk about the importance of flow in sustaining river ecosystems, and particularly to talk about the functions that flow carries out in rivers, being perhaps the main driver for not just biodiversity, but for a number of the biophysical processes in rivers. And I'm going to start off with a case study of a river in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, on which research has been done since the late 1960s and right up through to about 2007. And as you can see from the map there, the Great Fish River is now linked to the Orange River via tunnels and canals from the Gariep Dam, which provides water into this river for irrigation. Now, the Great Fish River was a seasonal river, so it used to stop flowing under natural conditions during the dry season in July and August particularly. But since the interbasin transfer from the Orange River, it now flows permanently. And this is what it looks like. The flow is very constant, 5 to 8 or 9 cubic meters per second the whole time. So if we look at a graph of the flow in blue before the interbasin transfer and after 1978 in red at the top and middle reaches of the river, and you can see that the red lines contain far less flow variability, and I want to just talk a little bit about the consequences of that. Okay, and one of the consequences is that this little fly, Simulium chatteri, very small, about 9 millimeters long or so, which breeds in the river. So its pupal and larval life stages are in the water, like mosquitoes, and then it emerges as an adult. And also like mosquitoes, the female of the adult female is a blood feeder on mammals, and particularly likes farm stock. Now this species was in the river prior to the interbasin transfer, but in very low numbers and amongst a wide variety of other blackfly and other insect species. And we have museum collections in which we could find 1 or 2 examples of this fly before the interbasin transfer. But since the interbasin transfer, this has become by far the dominant species of invertebrate on the riverbed. And this is what it looks like. You can see on the right of the screen there the larvae sitting on a pupal case. On the other side, on the left of the screen, you can see the head with what are known as cephalic fans, with which it filters food material out of the water. And down below, on the bottom left, you can see the one of those rays of those fans, and this species is able to filter material right down to microbial or bacterial level out of the water. But it relies very strongly on the current to carry the food particles. So it attaches itself to the substrate, as you can see with the larval picture there, and puts its head up into the current and filters food material out. So the hydraulic conditions in the river are extremely important for this species. Okay, and that's what it looks like on a stone. If you pick a stone out of the Great Fish River, you'll find during most parts of the year that it's got high densities of larvae and pupae on the stone. And if we look at the direction of the current going over that stone, you can see that the larvae particularly have positioned themselves exactly where that current is strongest going over the top of the stone. So you're getting very strong aggregations of large numbers of these larvae on stones in the river bottom. And this is some sampling that we did in the 1980s throughout a year when there was an unseasonal flood during the dry season. And what you can see is that in April, May, June, the population was declining as the temperatures reduced as we go into winter in the southern hemisphere. And then we had an unseasonal flood which basically wiped out most of the overwintering population of larvae. But nevertheless, because the eggs are down in the sediment and weren't washed away, when the temperatures start to increase in September, October, you see a very strong exponential growth of the larval population and with successive generations in spring. So that you can see that the density per 100 centimetres of stone were going up towards 5,000 or so per 100 centimetres. So very, very large spring populations, which cause real problems because, as I said, the female is a blood feeder, and this has become a major agricultural pest, biting farm stock. And also, since a number of the areas in the Middle Fish River are now high-cost eco-tourist destinations, because there are major conservation areas there, these are providing quite a lot of nuisance and interruption for the tourists. Okay, so what's happened is that one species which was in low numbers in the river has become now forms more than 98% of the total invertebrate population of that river. So it absolutely dominates the invertebrate populations as a result of the changing flow conditions. Okay, so when the river was a seasonal river, the overwintering population would die out because there was no current during the dry season. But now that the river flows throughout the dry months at the same level, it provides ideal habitat for that one species to the detriment of the biodiversity of the river. So my conclusion from this is that the flow pattern is a very important process in rivers, not only in terms of the amount of water, but also the variability of flow through time. And seemingly insignificant components like these black fly can provide a lot of valuable information about the sustainable management of these rivers. And the way to reverse this trend would be to cut off the irrigation flows during just 2 or 3 weeks during the winter months, which would get rid of the overwintering larval population. But at the moment, the farmers are unprepared to do that in this case. Okay, so if we go on from there to talk about what are environmental flows for rivers, okay, and then I'll talk a little bit about the way that these environmental flows can be assessed. How much flow do you need? What sort of variability? Okay, so environmental flows for rivers are about the quantity, quality and distribution of water required to maintain the components, functions and processes of aquatic ecosystems on which people depend. So this is not just about the nature conservation in the river. This is about what rivers do for people. Okay, and maintaining a flow regime, a modified flow regime usually, which will continue to provide the goods and services that people want from the river. Okay, so the assessment of any river will depend on the environmental objectives set for that system. Okay, and those are going to be different in each case. So the setting of environmental objectives is a very important part of the process. All right, so now I want to go a bit further north to the rivers of the Kruger National Park, South Africa, where we had a 10-year research program looking very largely at the consequences of flow changes in the rivers which all flow across the Kruger Park, which will rise outside the Kruger Park, okay, in the, to the west of the park and flow across the park, which is a very north-south elongated system, and then flow across the border on the right there into Mozambique. Okay, so, and the particular river that I want to look at in detail is the Sabi River, which again rises on outside the park on the Drakensberg Escarpment, flows through the park and then into Mozambique. And this was the river on which most of the research during the Kruger Rivers research program was done. Okay, so there's the Sabi River, looking at something called habitat integrity, which is a general survey of the conditions in the river. In this case, done from a video taken from a helicopter, which characterized each 5-kilometer section of the river. And the greener, the more natural it is, and the browner, the more modified and degraded, both in terms of the in-stream habitat integrity, the in-channel integrity, which is the colours above the river channel, and in terms of the riparian habitat integrity, which are the colours below the river channel. And what you can see there is that there's only one part of the riparian habitat which is still in a completely natural condition down near the Mozambique border. The light green is modified to a slight extent, the light brown to a moderate extent, and the dark brown are areas outside the park which have been quite heavily modified. Okay, so in the upper reaches of the catchment, there's been very extensive replacement of natural grassland with fast-growing commercial forestry crops, pine and eucalypts, and about 80% of the upper catchment is now covered in these commercial forestry projects. And what that's done, because these fast-growing trees use a lot more water than the natural grassland, is to reduce the low flows in the river by about 30% or so. That's with some of the irrigation which goes on in the middle reaches. There are the middle reaches, small holdings with some commercial irrigated agriculture and quite a lot of subsistence agriculture. Okay, there's the river as it goes into the Kruger National Park, and you can see the natural vegetation which has been maintained there, with the green band marking the riparian zone. Okay, now if we look at setting objectives, and this is a hypothetical example, the way that we developed for setting objectives for the rivers of the Kruger National Park is something known as an objectives hierarchy, where you start off with a very general vision, which everybody can understand and hopefully buy into, in this case to maintain as much of the natural diversity as possible while supplying the needs of people and protecting their health. Okay, now that can't be measured directly. So what you need to do is to break down that visionary statement into more and more detailed objectives until you've got something that can be monitored, measured and audited. So you might start off with, say, providing homes in the catchment with piped clean water without compromising downstream water availability, environmental health or natural goods and services. Getting more specific but still not really directly measurable. To minimise mosquito breeding habitat in terms of the health protection objective. To maintain perennial flow. Now that is something that can be monitored. If the river's flowing, you're meeting that. If you're not, you're not. Maybe to maintain catch per unit effort at more than 2 cichlid or tilapia fish of mass greater than 250 grams per hand line per hour. That's a measurable objective for some of the goods and services that are provided possibly by the river. And then you can get down to really detailed objectives like an average velocity of greater than 0.3 meters per second for 80% of the time to ensure habitat for net spinning caddis larvae of the order Trichoptera. Okay, now that is very measurable, but not exactly inspiring and not likely to get across to most of the stakeholders. That's what we call a TPC, or threshold of probable concern, which is a specific objective which can be monitored and measured, and which will indicate before there's a real crisis in the river that there may be something happening that could be a problem, and it requires a management response. So this is a very simplified example of the type of objectives that have been set now, not just for the rivers in the Kruger National Park, but for the whole Kruger Park ecosystem, tourism management, economics, and so on. And there's now a pile about that high of books which contain all these objectives, breaking them down to these detailed TPCs. Okay, so what we've got at the top end is something that's inspiring and understandable but unmeasurable, and at the bottom end something that's measurable but very often rather obscure for the non-specialist stakeholders. And linking those together means that if you're meeting these measurable but obscure objectives, then that leads to hopefully meeting the overall vision for the river or natural resource. Okay, so that's setting objectives. Now, here's an example of results for an environmental flow assessment, EFA, for the Middle Sabi River. These are recommended flows for normal years, what we call maintenance years in red, and for drought years in blue, where obviously the flows are going to be lower. So what we've got there is wet season base flows with then dry season base flows going down in July, August, September, October, and then with peak flows, small floods and larger floods on top of those. Now the question is, how did we get to those flows? What are they for, and how do you go about assessing them? Okay, so the natural flows would be of the range of 4 to 10 cubic meters per second in October base flows, with peaks up to about 42 cubic meters per second. And then in February, in the wet season, between 7 and 25 cubic meters per second base flows, with peaks up to 864 or even more cubic meters per second for quite large floods. So what you can see is that the recommended flows there in the red and blue line are much lower than the natural flows, but the assessment is that these would meet the objectives for the Middle Sabi River, and those objectives, because it's in a national park, are to maintain it in a slightly modified or as near to natural condition as possible. Okay, so how do we go about getting those? Oh, here's just an example. In the driest month in October, 2 cubic meters per second base flow, going up to 6 during the wet season in February. So the average environmental flow requirement would be 167 million cubic meters per year, or 30.5% of the natural mean annual runoff, MAR. Okay, so a lot of water can be taken out of these rivers in the opinion of the specialists who did this assessment without significantly modifying the condition of the river. Okay, so this would be a typical kind of section of the Sabi River within the Kruger National Park. There you can see extensive riparian vegetation, lots of different habitats, bedrock, some sand over there in the distance, reeds, some turbulent flow and some backwaters, giving a whole variety of habitats and so on. So this would be during a dry season low flow. And that's what we're trying to maintain, is that variety of habitats in different seasons. So if we take a cross-section across the river and characterize the kind of soils and vegetation and floodplain wetlands that we're seeing there, those are the kind of things we want to try to maintain. And if we survey that cross-section, we can then provide ourselves with a graphic which shows the different depths, the different types of habitats marked there, the width of the river, and on this right-hand axis, y-axis here, we've got the rated discharge for any depth. On the left-hand y-axis, we've got the corresponding discharge. So the specialist can use that hydraulic cross-section, rated cross-section, to estimate what the flows would be at any particular depth. And it also provides, the hydraulic model also provides the average velocities. Okay? So then the specialist can define these habitats in terms of depths, in terms of velocities, in terms of widths, in terms of the types of substrate and habitat that's going to be inundated at any particular flow. So what we can do then is we can look at different flows that might be required at different times during the year. With the red flow there, the dry season base flows to maintain some sort of survival fish habitat as the lowest requirement. The wet season base flows to inundate, just to inundate the marginal vegetation, the reeds and the sand on the edge of the river. Then some high flows maybe to replenish the wetlands happening occasionally during the wet season, and then the floods to inundate riparian vegetation and to flush sediments through the system. So that would be the kinds of, very briefly, the kinds of flows and motivations for those flows which would be provided by the various specialists. Okay, and the way that the specialists get these answers is usually to use indicator species. These are 3 fish species and hippos, which were used in the Sabi River, and a model known as PHABSIM, Physical Habitat Simulation model, was used to characterize the preferred habitat of these indicator species with changing discharges on the x-axis. So, and then on the y-axis you can see something called WUA, which is the wetted usable area or preferred habitat in terms of square meters per 300 meters of this part of the river. And what you can see with all the species is that as the base flows are reduced from 9 cubic meters per second, the habitat reduces, not equally for all the species, but for all those species it does reduce. But what's very interesting is that for all 4 species, when you get down to about 3.5 cubic meters per second, there is a very noticeable increase in the rate of loss of preferred habitat. So there, from the fish and aquatic mammal point of view, you could say that what they're indicating there is that once the flow goes below 3.5 cubic meters per second, they're going to not be very happy. They're not going to survive too well because their habitat is reducing very fast at flows below that. So that's the kind of ways that you can assess the flow requirements. Here's an example fish, Chiloglanus anoterus, which is a little rock caplet, only about that size, but very, very flow dependent. These graphs just show the characterization of the utilized in yellow and the preferred habitat in red, so that you can see in terms of this species, the faster the velocity, the more they like it, but they like shallow depths, and the substrate cover codes indicate that they like gravel and cobble. So they like these sort of gravelly cobble areas just at the bottom of riffles where the water's fast flowing and shallow. And they're going to be the first species that will start to disappear when the flows are reduced, those velocities are reduced, and their habitat is not going to be present. So this habitat preference was constructed by electrofishing and catching about 150 to 200 examples of these fish, and then measuring the velocities, the depths, and the substrate types where they were caught, and characterizing their habitats in those terms. Okay, similarly, you can use invertebrates. This one is the Simelium chutteri that I talked about before, and also Chematopsyche thomaseti, one of these net-spinning caddisflies which I've mentioned. And if you look at Simelium chutteri, you can see the black dots indicating that up to velocities of at least a meter per second, the abundance is going to be greater and greater, and that after a meter per second, you're really getting a maintenance of the same sort of densities. Whereas with Chematopsyche thomaseti, as the velocities increase, so you're getting increased abundances. So these, again, can be indicators of the types of flows that are needed to maintain not just these species, because you may, as I've pointed out, not want to particularly maintain Simelium chutteri, which is the problem species on the Fish River, but these give you an indication of how to maintain the general biodiversity of invertebrates in the river. Okay, similarly you can use riparian vegetation. This is a tree species, Brionardia salicina, which is characteristic of bedrock and boulder reaches of the river. Now, what's happening in many rivers around the world is that flows are being reduced, but because of erosion in the catchment, vegetation changes and so on, there's more sediment going into the river. So there's more sediment going in and less flow to move that sediment through. So very often in rivers such as the Sabi, which is typified by quite large bedrock sections and boulder sections, as the sediment gets deposited, you're losing those sections. And Brionardia is a good indicator species because the seedlings won't take in sedimented areas. So in this case, the threshold of probable concern would be if you're finding a lack of seedlings, because the adult trees will survive, in anastomosing or multi-channel sections of the river, indicating that you probably did have bedrock conditions, but now the sediment is covering over the bedrock, and that would be a long-term change in the river. So you can use all these different parts of the biodiversity to indicate what should be the flow conditions, the hydraulic conditions in the river. Okay, there's just a couple of diagrams of where the Brionardia salicina, B-sal, is in that pool rapid part of the river, is confined to the center part of the river. In the bedrock anastomosing part, you can see that B-sal is much more widely distributed through the river. Okay, so a couple of researchers, Kevin Rogers and a student of his, Andrew Carter, in the 1980s, looked at aerial photographs of the Sabi River and discovered that since the 1940s, what had been happening was that the river channel was narrowing, that there was considerable deposition of sediment over the years, and that this sediment was being consolidated by Phragmites reeds in the river. So what they were looking at, or what their hypothesis was, that you've got these natural bedrock and boulder sections of the river with abundant riparian vegetation gradually changing to these sandy bed sections of the river as sediment is deposited, with reeds consolidating them. And this is actually the Sand River tributary of the Sabi River, which is at a much further stage of this succession, where you've now got a very small active channel in a very large macro channel, about 200 meters wide, but the rest of the channel is deposited sediment which has been consolidated by these very extensive reed beds. Okay, so that was the idea from the aerial photography, which took us back to 1940. Then what happened in February of the year 2000 was that there was a very large flood came down the Sabi River, peaking at probably about 7,000 cubic meters per second. This is a picture of the flood as it receded. You can see in the bottom corner of the slide the remains of one of the road bridges. All the road bridges were taken out, and the river was widened, and a lot of the riparian vegetation was taken out. You can see a very large tree over the other side of the river there that's been uprooted, and you can see the devastation of the riparian vegetation. So this was a very large flood which got people thinking, well, now what's happened here? And has this happened before? And going back through the records, it was possible to find old photographs right back to the early years of the 1900s. This is a picture taken in 1912 of the Sabi Railway Bridge, which was built a few years earlier than that. And here you can see, again, quite extensive reed beds, evidence of extensive riparian vegetation, and quite a constricted channel. Well, then, in 1925, you can again see, hopefully, the Sabi Railway Bridge in the background of this picture. There was a very large flood which stripped out a lot of the riparian vegetation. You can see in the foreground the bare riparian zone, and widened the river channel. And this was very interesting because the then warden of the Kruger National Park, the first warden, Colonel Stevenson Hamilton, had in fact gone onto the railway bridge after the flood and marked where the flood went up to. So we had some indication of the magnitude of that flood. And in fact, this 1925 flood went about a metre higher than the 2000 flood, so was probably a little bit larger. But the 2000 flood was of the same sort of magnitude. Okay, then if you look in the 1930s and 40s, again the Sabi Railway Bridge giving us the framework, you can see that once again the very extensive reed beds have come back, the riparian vegetation has grown up again, and if we go to the 1990s, still a similar sort of condition, with the river quite constricted, a lot of deposition and a lot of reed growth. But then if we look after the flood went down, after the February 2000 flood receded, we can see that the riverbed and riparian zone is very similar to the situation in that 1925 flood photo. So what we're looking at here is some cyclical events over differing timescales, some of them very long, maybe about a century in this case, which are changing not just the habitat availability, but the whole channel characteristics and the riparian zone characteristics. And so we need to understand where we are in those different parts of those cycles at different timescales in order to understand what's happening in the river. There's Colonel Stevenson Hamilton, to whom we're indebted for a lot of information about not just the rivers, but the general condition of the Kruger National Park. Really, my message then is that flows are the main driving force for governing conditions in rivers, but that they don't just govern conditions that you're seeing at this time. You have to understand the historical conditions in the river, how it's changing geomorphologically, how dynamic the river channel is, what are the conditions in the riparian zone, and what are the conditions that you want to try and maintain so that the river provides the goods and services which people depend on. Thank you very much.